Welcome, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. So my name is Edward Kopp, Chief Curator of the Menil Drawing Institute, and it's our pleasure to welcome you this evening for a lecture by Isabel Bird. And she's been a fellow here since September, and the fellowship program at the Menil Drawing Institute is a key part of what we do. And it's a way for us to foster scholarship on drawing, mostly modern contemporary. And the hope is always to make possible rich, interdisciplinary, object-based conversation on the medium's history, theory, criticism, and practice. And we have 3 fellowships here at the Drawing Institute. One is the Morgan Menil Research Fellowship, which supports independent projects on drawing, with residencies at the Drawing Institute and at the Morgan Library in New York. The other fellowship, which was awarded this year to Isabel, is the Pre-Doctoral Research Fellowship, which really supports the research of doctoral candidates who focuses on drawing. And then finally, the Menil Drawing Institute Research Fellowship, which is awarded to accomplished scholars, conservators, artists, writers, or anyone whose work pertains to drawing. So as always, all our programs are free and accessible to all. And I have to point out that on May 4th, we'll have a program with Art Spiegelman, who will be in conversation with our director, Rebecca Rabineau, in connection with the Cy Lewin exhibition, which just opened last week. And then the rest of our programs, as always, are accessible on our website. So now a few words of introduction about Isabel. So Isabel is a PhD candidate in the history of art and architecture at Harvard University. While at the Menil, she's been working on a dissertation that studies the role of drawing in 20th century art practice through the medium's complex relationship to notions of skill, discipline, and instruction. Her project sets the drawing practices of 4 artists, Ruth Asawa, Adrian Piper, Sylvia Plimack Mangold, and Sturtevant, against a longer history of drawing education, and it argues that these artists' practices fundamentally challenge longstanding learning to draw techniques and exercises from linear perspective to life drawing class. And I must add that she's been an absolute joy to have around, and she's been really admirable in the way she's engaged deeply with our collection, but also very meaningfully with the local arts community and beyond. So our talk this evening is titled Drawn from the Classroom, and it considers how artists learn to draw through a close look at select drawings in the Menil collection, including works by Plimack Mangold, Arturo Herrera, Krasner, and Andy Warhol. And following the lecture, we invite you to stay and join us in the study room this way, where some of the drawings that she'll be discussing will be on view. So we really hope you can stay with us. And before we ask her to come to the podium, I'd like to remind you to please silence your cell phones. We're recording this program, and it will be made available on the Menil's YouTube channel in the coming days. If you have questions, please keep them until the end. There'll be a Q&A session, and then again, we'll go all to the study room. So now let's welcome Isabel Bird. Thank you.
Is this mic at the right height? Does this all sound good? Okay, I see a couple friends coming in, so I'll let them come in as I just get set up here. Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming tonight. It's really nice to see familiar faces. And thank you, Edouard, and thank you to Rebecca, and especially to Tony and Kirsten, Patrick, and Julia for helping to facilitate tonight's program, and to the whole rest of the team at MDI, Jan, Kelly, Catherine, Dominic, Brian, Abby, and Seneca, and to the Menil for creating such a supportive, inspiring, environment for this fellowship. It's really been such a dream of a year to be here immersed in the study of drawings, and I'm very grateful. And I'm also glad that it's not quite finished. I still have about 6 weeks left, which is a nice treat. So the plan, as we mentioned, as Edouard mentioned, we're going to do something a bit differently tonight, which is that very excitingly, we're going to have the study room open afterwards to look at some drawings. And so with this in mind, I've structured this talk, oops, and I realize I haven't gone to my slide. I've structured this talk to operate as a kind of guided visit through some of the works here in the Menil's drawing collection that I've come to love over the course of my time here and that have been particularly useful to me in my research. And so most of the works that you'll see on the screen will then actually be there in the flesh in the drawing room afterwards. So that's really a treat. So I hope this can be a kind of primer for close looking and conversation afterwards in the study room. So before getting to these works, I want to briefly frame the concerns of my research for you. My research really centers on the relationship between drawing and learning. So I'm interested in better understanding and studying how artists learn to draw, which might sound like a very simple thing, but it can be quite complex. So the pedagogical techniques that they practice, the influences that they absorb and reject, and I'm interested in how approaching drawings through this lens of study and learning, and from a kind of understanding that drawing itself is itself a process of self-education. So the artist learns as they look, they learn from the marks they've made on the page. How all this can perhaps better help us to think more expansively about how we define drawing, how we value it, why we do it, and why it continues to be such a foundational practice for so many artists, no matter their primary medium. So this is the one kind of activity I'm going to do, but I would like to see a show of hands. Who here has drawn before? Okay, that's what I expected. I think I saw every hand raised. Who here still draws today? Okay, that's a good fair amount. For those of you who did not raise your hands in response to that second question, I'm curious as to why that is. Is it because of some kind of distrust of your own level of skill in drawing? Is it because you or someone else at some point made the judgment that you are simply not good at drawing? I'm really interested in this phenomenon, this tension between drawing being both universally familiar to all of us and yet discarded after childhood by so many. Approaching artist drawings through this lens of study and learning can, I hope, offer a way towards challenging these very ingrained, stubborn notions of skill and expertise and value and quality that tend to cling to drawing as a discipline. And that tend, I think, to lead to grown-ups like us distancing ourselves from engaging with the practice directly. Approaching drawings through the lens of learning processes and thus through the lens of artists as people who are still learning can, I think, help us to counter the tendencies of master narratives and certain mythologized, again, stubborn ideas of skill and genius that, to me, can be often quite counterproductive to really getting into the art. This approach can also, I hope, help us to think about approach drawings that may seem less immediately representationally accessible. Drawings from the 20th century onwards, as largely represented by the Menil's collection, that have increasingly tended towards the formally abstract, or the materially strange, or the conceptually dense. Why draw a ruler, for example? Well, we're going to find out. Entitling this talk, Drawn from the Classroom, I'm using these words in a few ways. I'm using drawn from in the medium-specific connotation, referring to the artistic practice of drawing, but also in the other sense of drawn from as something taken, derived, obtained from a particular pedagogical source. Such a connotation might suggest both a kind of carrying over of influence or a kind of distancing from a received pedagogy, or it might simply suggest a kind of process of inevitable translation, a change that occurs in the movement of a drawing practice from one sphere into another. I'm interested in this process of translation, how drawing and its inherent movement can perhaps itself help us to understand more fluid learning environments. And by that I mean that when I say classroom, I'm speaking not just of a room full of students and an instructor in a school space, but really of any space within which an artist or a person is learning, even if they're by themselves. The last few years have made such a concept more familiar to many of us. For so many students, the classrooms, art classrooms included, became anywhere one could log into a Zoom. And so here I approach the classroom, and specifically the drawing classroom, in this more expansive sense, inclusive of informal, virtual, and self-taught spaces, environments, and processes. In my dissertation, I'm thinking this through with a range of artists, Sylvia Plimack Mangold, whom you see here, Ruth Asawa, Adrian Piper, and Sturtevant, all women for whom in the 1960s and 1970s, drawing was central to their practices and to their learning processes, and who drew through and from certain pedagogical techniques, relying upon them but also pushing back at them, challenging them, reinterpreting them, often long after they were in these more formal education spaces. And this period of the 60s and 70s was really crucial, as it was a moment at which both understandings of what art could be and what education could be were undergoing radical reevaluations. So this was a moment of expanded understanding of the mediums that counted as art, from video to performance to conceptual art, but also a moment of the birth of critical pedagogies and ideas of deschooling and unschooling that challenged received notions of what instruction looks like. Okay, so with that context in place, let's turn to what I've had the joy of encountering as my primary classroom this year, the space within which I have learned about the Menil Drawing Institute's collection. This is the Janie C. Lee Drawing Room, the study room just back there. And under the inspiring coordination of Kirsten Marples, this room is accessible by appointment to anyone in the community who would like to come in and look at drawings. And so I'll just leave this screenshot from the web up here for a moment as a little plug. Every few weeks over the last 7 months, thanks to the help of Kirsten and Patrick Yarrington, our amazing art preparator, I've made an appointment to come in and look at a dozen or so drawings. So I'm going to take you through some of these visits to show you how they've helped me think through some of these questions, and to take you through my process of looking at them. And I hope these observations can help you to look more closely in turn when we head into the study room to see them in person. And I'm going to move through 4 of the many interrelated drawing practices by which people learn to draw, which I've kind of structured as follows: drawn from the figure, drawn from sight, drawn from space, and drawn from the page. So let's start with one of the basics. Learning to draw the figure from life is one of the most enduring pedagogical artistic practices, and perhaps the one we most associate with academic, with a capital A. It was first formalized centuries ago in the so-called life rooms of art academies and has remained a constant popular practice into the present day, in both academic and informal circles alike. Approaches vary, but in general, it centers around a group of artists drawing a most often unclothed human model who occupies or is directed to occupy one or more poses for varying amounts of time over the course of a session. So I knew that this was one of the methods of drawing instruction that I wanted to think through in my time here. And I opened up the collection database and I searched words like figure and life and nude and model and mannequin and anatomy and body, and assembled a kind of wish list of drawings I wanted to look at. And a pair of drawings caught my eye. 2 charcoals from 1938, titled simply Nude Study from Life by the artist Lee Krasner. Now, I'm going to be honest and tell you that up until this point, Krasner had never really done it for me as an artist. Maybe it was the fact that my own art historical education had always placed her name second, in the shadow of and associated with the baggage of an extremely famous husband, Jackson Pollock. Maybe it was the fact simply that I had never stopped to look long enough at her work to sit and untangle its swirling abstractions. But these drawings, these hazy, heavily charcoal drawings, paired with such a sparse, classically academic title, these were curious to me. Nude study, where was the nude? And how was it studied? And were these really drawn from life? And so when I entered the study room that day, I ended up spending the majority of the session with these two drawings. Now, you might, like me, take some time to see the figure here. So I want to bring them up here and give you just a few seconds, a kind of pause, to really look at them. So I'm going to stop speaking for a few seconds, because I think it can be a bit like adjusting your eyes to a dark room, these drawings. It can take a little bit of time to slow down and see them. Okay, are you looking closely? What do you see? Can you see a body, a limb here, there? The longer I looked, the more parts of bodies began to crystallize into form. A belly button there, an earlobe here. But these works don't fully settle. The forms remain unstable. There's a really complex shuttling between figuration and abstraction happening here. Part of this happens through Krasner's deft handling of the charcoal. So note how she has a kind of base layer that she places down, and then she picks up and erases from that, and then she adds back onto it. And this detail here, you can see where she's really just taking the stick of charcoal, and you can see the impression of its form. And in doing so, she adds a sense of these forms to a sense of these forms being in process, in being kind of just on the edge of coalescing into joints and limbs, but reminding us all the while of pure geometries, squares and circles and all sorts of polygons and planes. Now, there's a history to such abstractions, even mechanizations of the human body, one that is told within this collection. So alongside the drawing on the left in the study room, you'll also see this drawing by de Chirico, where a kind of automaton of wooden slats opens an eye and stretches out a leg. And if you head over to the witnesses gallery in the main building, you'll glimpse a real-life drawing mannequin, or lay figure, an instrument by which artists drew the figure when they didn't have a live model readily available, or when, simply, they wanted a way to compartmentalize the parts of the body into a series of shapes. Now, I want to draw your attention to another detail in Krasner's drawings, the smallest of details, but one that can tell us a lot about a drawing's lifespan, about both the process of its making and its early moments of reception. At each corner of these drawings are several holes, pinpricks. These suggest a work that has been pinned and repinned, hung up and brought down, repositioned, returned to. They tell the story of an artist learning to see, of perhaps assessing her work mid-process, standing back, or of it being assessed by others, by classmates, by instructors. And as another aside, this won't be in the study room, but this is another fabulous drawing in the Menil's collection by the artist Serena, made entirely from piercing the paper with a sewing needle, so the pinhole itself becomes the drawn mark. So Krasner's pinholes sparked my interest, and after this session in the study room, I looked up the bigger picture behind these works. And as it happened, these drawings were indeed made in an actual classroom, that of Hans Hofmann's school in New York, where Krasner studied for about 3 years, from 1937 to 1940. She was, at the time, about 30 years old, coming off of many years of life drawing instruction at the Cooper Union, at the National Academy of Design, at the Art Students League, And here is a figure drawing from these years, so just about 5 years before the ones we have here. So these pinpricks tell the story of their making in Hoffman's classes. Krasner made hundreds of drawings like these from the figure model and from still lifes with charcoal on sheets of about this size, and you can find them in many museums across the country. So I'm showing you here one that I looked at just down the street at the MFAH, and another at the Met. And these pinpricks indicate aspects of Hoffman's pedagogy. They evidence perhaps a moment of critique when they were hung up to be looked at and even drawn on, again, in the process of that critique. And Hoffman was notorious for this. So in the one from the Met on the far right, you can see arrows that he drew in to kind of suggest a preferred sense of movement for the figure. Now, one response to such a kind of action on a drawing from an instructor might be that it doesn't really matter, that these are just student drawings. But in another light, such action might be suggestive of larger, often patriarchal power dynamics that can occur in classroom spaces. And so here it's worth noting the infamous, often repeated account of Hoffman telling Krasner that a drawing one day was so good you wouldn't know it was done by a woman. Krasner was understandably frustrated with the rigidity of Hoffman's pedagogy, one that insisted that students remain rooted to something they saw in the classroom, as she often wished to go kind of fully into abstraction. But again, these were merely student drawings. Such drawings are often not taken seriously, are often brought home and rolled up and forgotten about. Krasner herself, after leaving Hoffman's class, closed them up in some drawing portfolios, and there they sat in storage for nearly 40 years. And then, in the summer of 1974, as an artist of 65, she looked at them again. She chose 50 or so to keep and signed these, and so these are the ones we see now, like our own in the museum. And the rest, many of which were smudged due to the lack of charcoal fixative, well, these became raw material for entirely new works. So you can see her in the studio cutting these works up, and then they resulted in quite large works like this. And this is for a sense of the scale. So that's one of the Menil's little drawings. These later works have been analyzed in the relationship to Krasner's larger collage practice and to Hoffman's pedagogy. But what might they tell us about this practice of learning to draw the figure and about student work in general? To me, they suggest a taking seriously of student work, but also the fact that it can take some time to process it. They suggest a renewed moment of learning in hindsight. The series as a whole is titled 11 Ways to Use the Word to See. And so you can see she's used different verb forms as the titles in each one of those. And this suggests to me that there is more than one way to see and draw the figure. But what might the didacticism of that title, 11 Ways to Use the Word to See, tell us about how learning to draw relates itself to the practice of learning to see? On to part 2. Okay. So this relationship between learning to draw and learning to see. This is one of the questions that drives my interest across learning to draw techniques, but particularly my interest in line drawing. Line drawing can mean many things and look like many different things, but it often describes a practice whereby you trace only the outlines of the forms you see, or you don't pick up your drawing utensil from the paper, or you don't look at the page as you're drawing. And these can be variously known as contour drawings, continuous line drawings, line contour drawings. And the Menil has some pretty exquisite examples of such drawings. So this is one from Ellsworth Kelly that will be in the study room, and this by Matisse. And what works in this practice share, I find, is a kind of insistent intensity of looking, one that aims to distill the forms one sees into a single line. So look what Matisse does with these pomegranates. And I'll just say there's a great quote about Matisse talking about his ink drawings, and he says that he He always would do all sorts of studies in other mediums, in pencil and more forgiving mediums, before getting to the most rigorous medium, which for him was distilling something into this singular ink line. So I'm coming to line drawing from an understanding of how fundamental this practice has been within my own experiences of drawing education, but also because I am fascinated by its role for the practice of Ruth Asawa, who drew continuously, daily, throughout her life, and you will, I hope, all have the joy of seeing many examples from this part of her practice in many of her sketchbooks in the upcoming exhibition of her drawings, which will be first at the Whitney and then at the Menil in the coming year. Studying Asawa's line drawings got me interested in the pedagogical and popularized origins of this practice, which led me to this book, an enormously influential drawing manual, Kimon Nicolaides' The Natural Way to Draw, published in 1941, and this was a book with which Asawa was deeply familiar. It was published posthumously and traces the pedagogy of longtime Art Students League of New York instructor Nicolaides, and the very first exercise is on contour. Nicolaides equates the relationship between learning to draw and learning to see, but he also makes the case for seeing itself as a kind of multisensory experience. So I'll read a quote from this exercise where he says, "Imagine that your pencil point is touching the model instead of the paper. Without taking your eyes off the model, wait until you are convinced that the pencil is touching that point on the model upon which your eyes are fastened. And later," he says, "be guided more by the sense of touch than by sight." And then, in all capitals, "This means that you must draw without looking at the paper." And I encourage you all to try this. I'll have the book in the study room after, but we did it for a reading group here exercise, and it was really a lot of fun. So this emphasis on touch, on drawing from observation being somewhat counterintuitively just as much about the sense of touch as it is about sight, is really fascinating to me. And I'm really interested in how approaching line drawing through this framework, the framework via which it has been so popularly taught. So Nicolaides' book was very influential, and then later Betty Edwards would further promote his ideas through this idea of blind contour in her wildly popular Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which some of you might be familiar with. So I'm interested in how this might all help us rethink this relationship between line, sight, and touch, and how an increased sense of the process of line drawing as one of learning to see, as one of multisensory awareness, might shift our perception of, for example, a set of drawings like these. These are 6 portrait drawings by Andy Warhol, and I'll run through them here. And okay, I'll hold, before I get to that, hold. The first 2 will be in the study room. So Andy Warhol draws these of his friend and critic, Gene Swenson, in 1962. And I'm really interested in how these drawings suggest a kind of specificity of looking both at Swenson's face, but also at prior drawings, as each drawing feels informed by the other, as he works to distill this specific face sheet by sheet. And several more of these are at, so now I'll go back, the Spencer Museum in Kansas, and our conservator, Jan Barant, and curator, Kelly Montana, have been researching how the impressions of the pen marks on these sheets might help us get a sense of the order with which they were made from a single sketch pad. So stay tuned for further research from them on that front, and keep your eye out when we go into the study room for suggestions of these ghost impressions. So here's a picture with raking light where you can get a bit of a sense of that texture. Within the context of line drawing, however, these drawings strike me as another kind of limit case, another set of drawings caught at the threshold between multiple drawing techniques, just as the Krasners were caught between figuration and abstraction. So I'll focus on these 2, which are the 2 that we'll see in the study room. So on the one hand, there seems to be a clear evidence of Warhol really, really looking and using that shared sense of both sight and touch as he tries to mark down the specificity of the ridge of Swenson's nose, and here we go, between the two, and the chin. And we see him trying at proportions. So I love this moment here where he suggests one ear and then revises it. All of these really seem to suggest to me this sense of a kind of sensed and touched tactile contour line. And yet, against all of this, there is an entirely different mode of drawing happening here. So Warhol uses and repeats a very specific stylized line that he was well acquainted with and trained in from his time studying industrial art in school in the late 1940s and then working as a commercial illustrator in the 1950s. So look, for example, at the way in which this hair is drawn with a kind of elongated, curved, rectangular line that zips back and forth. And this line is used, again, for the shine of Swenson's lips. Do you see that? And his bottom eyelashes. And look, too, at the way he draws the eye. I bet you've seen this kind of bubble letter U shorthand for a pupil-iris relationship before in the glint of a comic book character's eye. Same goes for the stylized reflection of the glasses. And all of this is working still off the same kind of fundamental meandering block-like line. So these drawings feel caught to me between several learned modes. On the one hand, this practice of deeply observational drawing, a practice of really trying to understand and see one's subject from life. And on the other, these kind of shorthand, generic mark makings, lines of mark making. And along these two drawings in the study room, you'll see a few more drawings that further destabilize this kind of eye-hand foundation behind line drawing. So in the study room, you'll see William Anastasi's subway drawings, in which the artist closed his eyes and placed his headphones on and sat on the subway and let the sway of the car generate the curves of his contours. And then there's Robert Morris's blind time drawing, in which the artist wrote out for himself a set of instructions. So the beginning reads, "With eyes closed and estimating a lapse time of 60 seconds, both hands work to blacken a rectangular bar at the top of the page. Eyes are opened, and this is studied for 60 seconds." And then it goes on. And then, this is one of my favorites, there's Trisha Brown's left foot drawn by right foot and vice versa, in which the artist and dancer place the drawing utensil between her toes rather than her fingers. So I'll just let that process sit in for a moment, because the utensil was between her toes. This is drawn with her feet. Okay, so I've just taken you through instances of lines drawn freehand or free foot, for that matter. We're now going to move to the other side of the coin, to lines that are in some way structured or determined by an external device. Artists often rely upon external tools and systems to help them translate what they see onto a surface, and this is particularly the case when they are learning to draw space, to translate the three-dimensional world we see before us onto a two-dimensional surface. Now, one of the most typical systems used for this is that of linear perspective. Many of you, I imagine, back when you learned to draw, encountered this system, maybe even through an image like this, in which a single-point perspective system is illustrated with the device of a railroad, which demonstrates how parallel lines will converge as they recede into a single centered vanishing point on a horizon line. Now, this is, of course, simply a visual device, a construction, that helps us flatten space onto a surface. If we were to walk along that railroad, we would never arrive at that vanishing point or at that horizon line, and the tracks would remain parallel. But as a system of drawing, it's really kind of so ingrained now that we probably don't even really notice what's happening. So I want to think here about how artists can help us draw attention to the constructed nature of these such systems, to help us not take them for granted, to question them, to play with them. So take, for example, this work by Lenore Tawney on view in the study room, which allows us to see this system for what it is, a set of lines on paper. Or, for example, consider this work by Sylvia Plimack Mangold. And again, this is a complex work, so let's just sit with it for a moment. I'm going to zoom in to the frame. Okay, so we see a set of gridded tiles receding into space, but something strange is going on here. One ruler recedes while the other lays flat against the page. This drawing, too, has its roots in a classroom situation. As a student at Cooper Union in the late 1950s, Plimack Mangold recalls almost failing out of a class in her first year because she struggled to correctly complete a perspective assignment. Worse still, the instructor said to her, right there in front of the whole class, that she might as well just quit school and get married. She did go on to pass the course with the help of some more sympathetic classmates, and several years after this experience, she returned to the problem of perspective on her own terms. She began to draw the floorboards of her apartment again and again, using them as a kind of ready-made perspectival grid for herself of receding orthogonals. So this is a great drawing that I looked at the Blanton since I've been here. And here are a few more where she's kind of complicating it by tossing laundry onto that grid. And I just want to say thank you to Frederica Hunter, who's here, for helping to facilitate my viewing of some works that are of Plimack Mangold's that are here in Houston. And here, too, for any of you that were here in the 90s, this is a traveling retrospective of her work that was at the Blaffer. So Plimack Mangold was not alone in turning to the floor as a source of inspiration. Beside this work in the study room, you'll see this contemporaneous work by Jack Whitten from 1970, who constructed a purpose-built drawing board on the floor of his studio, and then made a series of rubbings upon it. Now, both Plimack Mangold and Whitten are drawing space via an externally supplied line. So in Whitten's case, that line is relayed by the drop in surface pressure that occurs as he moves a stick of carbon across the floor and loses contact at the groove between the floorboards. And this results in this straight line via the absence of mark or kind of negative space. In Plimack Mangold's case, that externally supplied line is that of a pencil drawing along the edge of a ruler. So yes, the image we see here of the ruler is also the tool by which she made almost all of the lines in this image. In bringing the ruler into her image, as she does in the Menil's drawing, she immediately complicates and points to the construction of our sense of how we measure space and how we depict it. So she's really making transparent these tools, and she's also challenging their presumed sense of a standard. So in this drawing, we get both a kind of flat ruler and a receding ruler, and that gives us two conflicting senses of scale and measurement in the same page. So that flat ruler, and you'll see when you go in, it's to scale. It's 6 inches. You could lay a ruler next to it. But the receding one is not to scale. It's not actually 6 inches. It's much shorter. But it is to scale if we read it according to the illusion of the space that she has created. So it's a really kind of complex trick that's happening. Plimack Mangold inscribes the drawing with the following written out, where it says, "Where the appearance of diminishing 3-inch tiles determines the length of a diminishing 6-inch measure." And the phrase suggests to me that her perspective, and note the doubled connotation of perspective. So perspective can be both this kind of objective, supposedly objective device, but also a kind of inherently subjective point of view. So this suggests to me that her perspective as an artist has determined the length of this ostensibly standard measure. So the appearance, the artist's invented illusion, determines the measure and not the other way around. Writers on Plimack Mangold's work have tended to emphasize the apparent skill of her handling of perspective, lauding her work as a kind of textbook case of the technique. But I'm really interested in the idea that these moments actually began with this moment of supposed failure. in the often unremarked upon fact that she didn't start out so easily with the technique of perspective, and nor would she claim even today to have any such mastery. So she returns to linear perspective after that moment of failed sexist instruction in the classroom on her own terms and builds her own rules of perspective in the process. The Menil's particular drawing was made as a study, not for a painting, but for an artist's book, Inches and Field. And I'm showing here the spread in this book, this book here, which we'll have a copy of in the study room. This book compiled and built on material that she had generated in a journal that she kept for the entirety of 1977. And you can see here a page from the journal, which is in the Yale Art Gallery. And on one page of this journal, she writes out the following. She writes, "It is as if I were educated by making the works and then responding to them." And this has been really crucial for my thinking, because I think it foregrounds how, by the end of over a dozen years of independent study into linear perspective, Plimack Mangold came to realize that her own process of drawing was itself a valid form of self-instruction and important as an end in itself. And in my broader dissertation chapter on this body of work, I'm interested in how this book might operate as a kind of alternative drawing or perspective manual. So what would it be like to learn linear perspective from such insistently subjective, personal pages, pages that are transparent about the very nature of their making? A series of diary entries and drawings that image the very aids, rulers, gridded lines through which the drawing was made. For starters, I think, such a textbook would counter the presumption, if we return to that moment in the Cooper Union classroom, that there could be an incorrect perspective in the first place. Okay, last one, drawn from the page. This past summer, just before arriving in Houston, I spent 2 months at the Huntington Library in California, studying a remarkable archive called the Diana Korzenick Collection of Art Education Ephemera and Books. And there I studied hundreds of drawing manuals and other forms of the material evidence of drawing instruction. So this is just a sampling of some from the last 200 years. And it was a kind of immersion in the material history of how people have learned to draw over the centuries, often in more self-instructive, distributed ways, exactly the kinds of ways I've been talking about. And it was fascinating, the glimpse it offered into not just the way in which drawing instruction has been and continues to be widely and informally transmitted, often outside of the formal classroom, but even more so by the evidence it offered of student activations of that instruction, from the copy to the coloring book. So you see 2 examples here of drawn in by some child at some point. So this was the perfect prelude and historical foundation to arriving at the MDI's strengths in 20th and 21st century drawing practices. And it was another aspect of drawing instruction that I was interested in studying when I came to the Menil, and thinking through how such printed instructional materials and their activations, from the child's scribble to the adult's absent-minded doodle, might be glimpsed within this collection. So I came upon examples of artists drawing from already extant popular imagery, as with, for example, the American flag. So here we have Jasper Johns' take, and Oldenburg's take, and these 2 will both be in the study room. Or there was the example of Niki de Saint-Phal riffing off the contours of a child's rubber stamp. And within all 3 of these works, which will all be in the study room, there is a kind of elevated scribble or doodle happening here. And you can imagine my delight to learn, upon searching through the collection one day, about these marvelous collages by Arturo Herrera, works from a series of some 50 collages, and I'll show you here, there's several more in the Menil's collection. One will be on view in the study room, and then there's a segment held at MoMA, so you see one of those there, and there's a segment held at the Art Institute of Chicago. And in these collages, Herrera repurposes used crayon-scribbled pages from Disney coloring books. Now, Herrera's works have been analyzed from a variety of angles. Our own Graham Bader at Rice has written beautifully about their role in a larger history of collage, and others have commented on the way in which they distort and disturb popular imagery. But what I want to do here really is focus in on the single question of this source material of the coloring book. So again, let's just look closely at one, because these are quite complex, and they get a bit flattened on the screen. So again, it will be good to see it in 3 dimensions in the study room. It can take some time for the figure to emerge with such a work, but as it does here, it might start to become kind of iconically familiar to you. Cinderella holding a connect the dots glass slipper, an elephant's trunk from Dumbo. So Herrera has these found used coloring books, and he then very carefully, with an X-Acto knife, excises their outlines and forms and collapses different sheets together so that we're seeing the glimpses of one illustration through the negative form of another. This does a few things. For one, the distorted appearance of these Disney characters speaks to the way in which a child's activity book, what might seem to be a relatively harmless tool, can serve as a form of marketing and indoctrination. So these books are essentially advertisements for Disney content when we think about it. And I'll note one of the fascinating things from my research in the Huntington Archive was that this is the case with the earliest American coloring books and copybooks. They're all often about pure product placement, kind of unabashedly. Herrera also is not alone in pointing to the more insidious aspects of the coloring book as a form, or potentially insidious, I should say. And this subject could be a whole talk in itself, but for now I'll just point you to the direction of the work of Sable Elise Smith, whose ongoing coloring book project takes as its primary material a found coloring book distributed to children in court lobbies. And Smith has spoken in an interview of the coloring book's form as being a kind of, she quote, foreclosure of imagination, which I think is a really productive way of thinking about this, because it speaks to both our assumption that such tools would be all about imagination, and then the idea that they actually can close that off. So I want to then, with that in mind, draw your attention back to Herrera's drawing, and the remains that we see here, the evidence of an actual child's drawing within this drawing, coloring this page. So again, it's going to take some time to see this, and I think Jan can maybe help us think about this in the study room afterwards, but it looks like the crayon has really faded a lot with time, but there's a kind of red glove here, red crayon on the glove, and then yellow on the skirt. And then you can see here just the hints on the outside of red and blue and green around the cut there. And this is evidence of the child's drawing, but also the child drawing outside the lines. That's the only reason we see these marks. So again here we have a learning to draw device that has been brought to its limit. Herrera is quite literally cutting out on the lines, in some cases removing the very lines that the child or reader is supposed to follow. And in doing so, he opens cracks in the coloring book's pictorial narratives, collapsing one scene onto another, challenging the possibility of a single ordered fill-in-the-lines drawing. In doing so, these works point, in their very material and formal construction, to the way in which one of the most popularly distributed modes by which children, and thus people, learn to draw, the coloring book, is a form that has itself become almost synonymous with a certain idea of prescribed behavior. So to color within the lines is itself now an idiom for behaving conventionally or following the rules. Maybe it's no surprise then, given this kind of foreclosing of imagination that happens around so many early drawing practices, that we still have this idea around good and bad drawers, around correct and incorrect perspective, around a right and a wrong way to draw. So to come full circle, here's Houston's own Joseph Havel, this is his work, How to Draw a Circle. This is a set of 12 drawings from a larger series shown at Paz de Butler some years ago, in which 6 drawings were made at a time. And as the artist put it, he was, quote, just trying to figure out how to draw a circle. Now, let's sit with that again for a second. Trying to figure out how to draw a circle. Those are words said by a mature artist in his early 60s at the time he makes this, and he's still learning to draw. Those words suggest to me a kind of openness. So think about how to draw a circle. That feels presumably like the simplest building block there is. But if one has this stance of receptivity towards learning, towards continuing to learn, that's the kind of openness that I think drawing can model for us. So with that, I'll close with the hope that all of you might pick up a pencil and try drawing anything, even a circle, even if it's been 10, 20, 30 years, and see what happens. Thank you.
And I have a mic here. If anybody has a question, just raise your hand.
Thank you so much for the talk. Really enjoyed it. I was wondering, the Lee Krasner drawings are fantastic. I was wondering how original are they? Or are they representative of a certain, style or method that was practiced in Hoffman's studio?
That's a very interesting question. I think, so if you look at other drawings from classmates of hers, so Mercedes Matter, for example, there are definitely certain commonalities, and you might even mistake one of those for a Krasner drawing. But I think it's interesting, your use of the word original and the kind of impulse to ask that, which I think speaks actually exactly to some of these questions that I'm interested in around originality itself as a kind of valued thing. And yeah, it's a kind of open, continuous question for me. But I think I'll say for myself, that's less what I'm interested in. So I'm more interested in the kind of process and what this process meant for Krasner than a question of whether the drawings she made in this classroom look like other drawings in that classroom. But it's a really good kind of fundamental question, and I think a question that comes up a lot with this question of influence and student work. I mean, one thing that was interesting is that Hoffman wouldn't show his own work to his students, which was kind of unusual for a lot of art teachers. And so then actually, I think that actually makes it even more interesting that one can still have similarities then in the work that the students are creating.
Thank you, Isabel, so much for your talk. This is a question for you about the role, the role drawing has played in your own learning. So to what extent do you use drawing in your historical work and your close looking, etc.?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. That's definitely, I probably should have mentioned more, but I came to art history and to the study of drawings through myself drawing, and I loved to draw ever since I was little. And so I realize I might be a little biased when I'm saying there's no such thing as, when I'm encouraging you all to draw. But I love drawing, and for me, I'm really interested in how kind of, as an art historian, how as art historians we can really think about how practice and kind of knowledge of a process and practice and an active practice can inform what we're studying. So for me, there's definitely a kind of constant relay, and I try to draw every day, and then that helps me see things differently in the work that I'm studying and vice versa. So yeah, it's definitely, and I'll often try and do the things that I'm studying particularly. So I've been doing a lot of contour drawing this year. Yeah.
Thank you, Isabel. That was such a rich and provocative talk.
Thanks,
I
Kevin.
have just a couple of questions about Mangold. One question is just like looking at the example of that you showed first of the vanishing point of like that instructional book of the train tracks. I'm just curious about like, why do you have a sense of why Mangold is becomes so fixated on the floor as opposed to like a view out? Because it seems like the drawings and paintings you showed us are all of like floorboards. So I'm just curious about like why there seems to be like a perspectival attention downward in a way as opposed to outward. And then my other question is, is she engaging in any way in her journals or whatever other experiments with either like pre-Renaissance perspectival rendering techniques or like non-Western perspectival techniques at all?
Thank you, Kevin. Those are great questions. So she talks a lot about the floor, and at one point she says she turns to the floor because it's a kind of system through which she can structure space. And so she really does see the floor as it's a ready-made grid for herself there. And there's you can really track. I've gotten really deep into rabbit holes of tracking the different parquets as she moved from apartment to apartment, because she even says at one point she and Robert Mangold moved to a place a few blocks down in downtown New York, and she says, part of the reason I went in for the rental was because of this floor that they had, that this is a really complex parquet. But I think, to me at least, I think it's partly because it's just this stable thing, right, that she can turn to each day, and she was raising 2 young children, and it was right there for her. It was this kind of ready-made drawing material. Then the second question is a really good one. In all the work I've seen, she really sticks with this kind of self-constructed system that's both playing off of a certain Western linear perspective model, but then is very quickly becoming her own. So I didn't go into it here, but there's this amazing part of her practice where she actually starts at one point to explicitly plot the vanishing point according to her age and years. So when she's 36, she puts the vanishing point at 36 inches high, which I think is really just wonderful and a kind of funny joke, but also it's great because it points us to, okay, why not put the vanishing point at 36? It's as arbitrary as any other kind of height. But it also, again, speaks to this collapse that I'm really interested in her work between perspective as this kind of ostensibly objective external system and perspective as one's own view onto the world that's highly specific. So she's, by making the vanishing point her age, she's speaking directly to that.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and I love that question about perspective. And you just reminded me, as someone who is still in the process of raising 2 young children, you actually spend a lot of time on the floor because children spend a lot of time on the floor and you're sitting down on the floor with them. So like your whole perspective is lowered. But this drawing also reminded me of Dutch perspectival systems. And, Svetlana Alpers makes that whole case that, the one-point vanishing idea is so, Southern Renaissance. And the Dutch, there's a great kind of different version of perspective that does use multiple vanishing points that are not tied to one particular place. And the name, of course, is escaping me, but you can find it in Svetlana Alpers' book, and it's really interesting because you can see the room kind of undulating when we just think about perspective as something, as you were just saying, as like more personal, mobile, the world as a reflection and not necessarily a window, and all of those kinds of arguments. So I was curious if she possibly was interested in Dutch painting at all?
Yeah, she was interested in a lot. She talks a lot about different, all the different kind of influences. I've only seen, I'm trying to think if I think I've only seen works where she really sticks to this single point perspective, which again is kind of fascinating to me because that's the assignment that she almost failed out on, and that's the assignment that many people might think is the kind of most straightforward, but it's almost, I think there's an interesting insistence upon kind of breaking down that system. But thank you for that's a great reminder to think about the Alpers, and think through this, because I am interested in placing these works in this kind of broader tradition of drawing from the floor and using the floor as a perspectival system.
Yeah, like Peter Sonradam definitely has multiple perspectival points in his church drawings, and they do focus a lot on the floor, even as they also focus on the space.
Yeah. Thanks.
I just wanted to ask, where would you put something like automatic drawing?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, again, these are kind of like constructed categories that I've come up with as a way of kind of working through some of these techniques, but of course they're all very much interrelated. And so I think there are parts of automatic drawing that relate to contour drawing and line drawing, and there are, I mean, certainly you can kind of put the Anastasi, for example, in that tradition of automatic drawing. So I think I'm not looking at automatic drawing specifically as a kind of, but it's definitely informing, it comes in here and there it's as an influence, and definitely, various surrealist drawing practices have been really, that's a great part of being here this year, is getting acquainted with histories of surrealism, given the strengths in this collection, and really understanding their investment in drawing more broadly. Yeah.
I was just wondering if have you ever come across a drawing that maybe wasn't made on acid-free paper or not archival and studied it over a period of years? And if you have, what are your thoughts about that?
So that's a good question for our conservators, maybe Jan, who might be in the study room afterwards. But I mean, I can say anecdotally, I've definitely seen with just my own drawings that I sometimes make on cheap paper, and if I post one up on the cabinet window that's in the sun, and I notice 4 months from now that all of a sudden that, if it's with a ballpoint pen drawing, that all of a sudden that ink has started to fade away. But I'm not trained enough in conservation to be able to kind of know more about what's going on there. But we have a really amazing paper conservation lab here, so I encourage you to seek out Jan afterwards and ask more about that. So should we head into the study room? We will.
Yeah, we can go in this door. I'm just not sure everybody's going to fit in there at one time. So
we may have to kind of trickle in slowly, but I'll be in there if we want to talk more. Thank you all so much for coming.